Well, hey everyone, welcome to the Ridge Community Church Online. My name is Tyler and I get to serve as our online campus pastor, and we are so glad that you are choosing to join us today. Hey, wherever, whenever, and whoever you're watching with, it's just an honor to spend some time together. In fact, I'm just so thankful for technology and all the tools that we get to be able to gather together online, because here's what we know about church. Church isn't just a building that we go to, but rather the church is a group of people who are on a mission together, and that mission is the Ridge's mission, is to help people find and follow Jesus, and we can do that wherever we are. But we also know that we were created to be around other people. And so what I want to encourage you to do, if you've been watching the Ridge Online for a while now, and it's been really helpful for you, I want to encourage you to start gathering your friends or your family and hosting what we call a watch party. And a watch party is just very, very simple. You just gather your friends and your family and you watch the Ridge Online together, and you have fun doing that. Maybe you host a meal, maybe you talk about some of the things that you learn. It doesn't have to be complicated. All you can do really is just press play, but you gather together and you watch the Ridge Online together. Now, if this is interesting to you, I want to invite you to go to the website that you see below me and let me know that you're interested. And you just click the little form that's there, fill out some information, and then I'm going to follow up with you later this week to make sure that you have everything you need to host a great and fun watch party. So just go ahead and check out that website there. Hey, today we are actually in part 3 of a series that we're in called Live Big, which is really a big season for us at the Ridge, where we just take some time and we live big in our communities by giving big, serving big, and loving big. And today is a special day as we are going to hear from Pastor Kurt Owens, who's actually going to talk to us about how to break the cycles of poverty. It's such an encouraging and helpful message. In fact, I would encourage you right now to take this link and share it with a friend and say, hey, would you just watch this with me, because this is going to be so helpful for all of us. Now, before we turn it over to Pastor Kurt, the band is actually going to lead us in a couple of songs. And I would encourage you just to use these songs to connect with God. You can sing them out loud. You can reflect on the words. In fact, I want you to pay attention to the words that show us who God is and what He says about us so that we can live big. So I'm going to turn it over to Nate right now, and they're going to get us started.
Come on, let's praise. Just one word, you calm the storm that surrounds me. Just one word, the darkness has to retreat. That's right. Just one touch, I feel the presence of heaven. Just one touch, my eyes are open to see. My heart can't help but believe. There's nothing that our God can't do. There's not a mountain that He can't move. Oh, praise the name that makes a way. There's nothing that our God can't do. Just one word, you heal what's broken inside. Just one word, and you revive every dream you do. Just one touch, I feel the power of heaven. Just one touch, my eyes are open to see. My heart can't help but believe. There's nothing that our God can't do. There's not a mountain that He can't move. Oh, praise the name that makes a way. There's nothing that our God can't do. Oh, there's nothing that our God can't do. There's not a prison wall He can't break through. Oh, praise the name that makes a way. There's nothing that our God can't do. Yeah. I will believe for greater things. There's no power like the power of Jesus. So let faith arise. Let all agree, there's no power like the power of Jesus. I will believe for greater things. There's no power like the power of Jesus. So let faith arise, let all agree. There's no power like the power of Jesus. I will believe for greater things. There's no power like the power of Jesus. So let faith arise, let all agree. There's no power like His power. There's nothing that our God can't do. There's not a mountain that He can move. Oh, praise the name that makes a way. There's nothing that our God can't do. There's nothing that our God can't do. Proclaim it. There's not a prison wall He can't break through. Oh, praise the name that makes a way. There's nothing that our God can't do. Yeah, come on, let's lift Him up. Well, what a great truth to sing together today. Hey, as we continue in our time, I'm actually going to read a passage of scripture over us. This is out of Luke 15. It says, "Now the tax collectors and sinners were all gathering around to hear Jesus. But the Pharisees and teachers of the law muttered, 'This man welcomes sinners and eats with them.' Then Jesus told them this parable. 'Suppose one of you has 100 sheep and loses one of them. Doesn't he leave the 99 in the open country and go after the lost sheep until he finds it? And when he finds it, he joyfully puts it on his shoulders and goes home. Then he calls his friends and neighbors together and says, "Rejoice with me, I have found my lost sheep." I tell you that in the same way, there will be more rejoicing in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 righteous people who don't." And I don't mean to say that God Himself is reckless, but the way He loves is quite. He doesn't weigh the pros and cons of loving us. He doesn't care about any risk of chasing after us. In fact, He knows that we're not perfect and prone to stray, yet He chases after us, and He would give His life for us again and again and again, in hopes that maybe we would respond with love. So we have a chance to do that now. Respond with love. Join us.
Before I spoke a word, you were singing over me. You have been so, so good to me. Before I took a breath, you breathed your life in me. You have been so, so kind to me. Oh, the overwhelming, never-ending, reckless love of God. Oh, it chases me down, fights till I'm found, leaves the 99. I couldn't earn, and I don't deserve, still you give yourself away. Oh, the overwhelming, never-ending, reckless love of God. When I was your foe, still your love fought for me. You have been so, so good to me. chases me down, fights till I'm found, leaves the 99. I couldn't earn it, and I don't deserve it. Still you give yourself away. Holy, overwhelming, never-ending, reckless love of God. Yeah. Coming after me. There's no wall you won't kick down, lie you won't tear down, coming after me. There's no shadow you won't light up, mountain you won't climb up, coming after me. There's no wall you won't kick down, lie you won't tear down, coming after me. No shadow you won't light up, mountain you won't climb up, coming after me. There's no wall you won't kick down, lie you won't tear down, coming after me. There's no shadow you won't light up, mountain you won't climb up, coming after me. There's no wall you won't kick down, lie you won't tear down, coming after me. Oh, the overwhelming, never-ending, breathless love of God. Oh, it chases me down, fights till I'm found, leaves a 99. And I couldn't earn it, I don't deserve it, still you give yourself away. Oh, the overwhelming, never-ending, reckless love of God. Yeah.
That song, Reckless Love, that just describes the love that God has for you and me, that He would actually go out of His way to do whatever it takes to live in a loving relationship with us. So much so that He sent His Son to live among us, to die and rise again, so that we can put our hope and our trust in Him to receive this new life that we have with God that starts today and lasts forever. And the great news is that love enables us to take that same love and demonstrate that to others. And I think a great example of that is actually with one of our partner organizations called City on a Hill. And City on a Hill, they're taking that love and they're demonstrating it to kids and students living in Milwaukee. And they've had to make several different adjustments due to the pandemic. And they're doing a great job. In fact, they took some time and they shared it with us. And I want you to check this out on the screen right here.
Hi, I'm Lisa Boughton, and I am the Youth Development Manager here at City on a Hill. And I just want to give an opportunity to share with you guys a little bit about what is going on in our world. Usually at City on a Hill, we serve an average of 200 and 250 students throughout the school year and summer in educational activities, life skills, employment training, and an after-school setting. As COVID transitioned, our world dramatically changed, and the lives and the world of our students dramatically changed as well. And our team kicked into high gear to connect and build that bridge between schools and families, to make sure that our students weren't having educational gaps and that the transitions that they already go through while living in crisis were going to be as smooth as possible. You know, we have a good way of building long-term relationships with the people that we serve. They become part of our family. And so just how you may react to your family in need is how we chose to react to our family in need. We knew that without having a solid education plan, that the opportunity for failure was so high. And so as we connected between parents and students and schools, we started to fill in these gaps. You know, some of the things that we found that were surprising to us was really just the parents' fear of not having adequate supervision for their kids while they worked. Working with a lot of single moms or single parents, they were concerned because the school was providing so much support for them. And so we started to flip space. We went from 6 computers in 2 computer labs to 6 computer labs to over 20 computers and an additional 15 Chromebooks. We changed our library space into a classroom setting. We flipped our large group space into places where students can participate in activities. And we invited students to do remote learning at our new remote learning center right here on site. Right now, we have 24 students that attend school at City on a Hill. They represent 9 different schools in the Milwaukee Public School System. And so 5 days a week, students arrive. 7:30 in the morning, they check into our COVID safety station because being safe is so important to us. Our staff remain masked. Our staff are temperatured, as well as students who, as they enter our building, come into a clean and disinfected space. They check in and receive all of the services that would keep them safe. Masks, sanitizer, individual learning space. Every one of them has their own materials that nobody touches but them. We're still looking for a few tutors, maybe in math or Spanish. If you're interested, you can contact our volunteer coordinator. And our hope is that together, with your support and your prayer and our staff, we can make a difference in the lives of the students in the Central City of Milwaukee. Thank you for your time.
What an incredible impact that City on a Hill is having in their community. And we get to play a part in that impact by being a part of Live Big. But another way that we can have a huge impact on our communities is by giving generously back to God. And the reason for that is when we give back to God, it actually fuels the mission to help people find and follow Jesus, and it helps the ability to help more people find and follow Jesus grow and grow and grow. And so when we give, that can lead to transformed lives, which ultimately leads to transformed communities. And so right now we're going to head into the part of our service where we bring our offerings back to God. I want you to know that if you're just visiting, or if you don't call yourself a Christian, you could actually let this part of service just pass you by. But if you do call yourself a Christian, I want to invite you to take this step of faith today and to give back to God and to fuel that mission to help more people find and follow Jesus. There are several ways that you can give digitally. Just visit the website that you see below me. And we're going to take a moment together where we can bring our offerings to God together digitally. And then we're going to hear from Pastor Kurt.
Well, hey, I want to welcome you to week number 3 of our annual Live Big initiative, where for 4 weeks we get the opportunity to impact a ton of lives. If you're new with us and you don't know what Live Big is, each year we challenge our entire church and anyone else who wants to be involved with it each year for Live Big. We have people who wouldn't consider themselves church people that are a part of Live Big. And what we do is we practice living out the words of Jesus where he said it is better to give than to receive. And so for 4 weeks each year, we challenge everybody to reprioritize our life, and the filter is giving over receiving. And when we talk about giving, one of the ways we talk about giving is we give financially, and we challenge everybody to give financially towards Live Big. And at the end of the series, then 100% of everything given towards Live Big goes to some great local nonprofits that are helping those in need. And if you haven't given yet to Live Big, you can give through the end of the series, and you can go on our Live Big page, theridgecc.com/Live Big. And as I said, you got till the end of next week. And so if you haven't done it yet, or you feel inspired and led to give more, want to encourage you to do that, because as we know during this season, there's been a huge economic fallout. And that has hit especially hard our local nonprofits. And so we get a chance to just be very, very generous with them as they are generous in helping those in need. Now, another way we challenge people to give is to give of their time and talents to serve those in need. And it was just mentioned a little bit earlier, we want to encourage everybody to serve those in need in some way. And once again, you can go on our Live Big page to do that. You can serve at one of the nonprofits. There's a lot of opportunities to do that. If you don't feel comfortable yet kind of going out and about, you can serve other people from your own home. We have ideas for you to do that. And if you're watching us from somewhere that's not maybe close to one of our locations, there's ways that you can serve people in need right where you are. Now, today is going to be a very special day as we're going to hear a great story from a very special person. Pastor Kurt Owens is someone, as you're going to see, is truly living big. Pastor Kurt grew up a pastor's kid and then eventually became a pastor, and you're going to see, much to everybody's surprise, he became a pastor. Now, Kurt has an undergraduate degree in business, he has a master's degree, and he's currently getting his doctorate. And Kurt is the head of 3 very high impactful organizations. He's currently in the process of planting You Flourish Church. He's the president of the Milwaukee Declaration, which is a group of suburban and urban pastors that get together and are breaking down racial walls through the lens of the gospel. And he founded an organization called Bridge Builders, which is a fabulous nonprofit that's committed to neighborhood transformation, 1 block at a time, and you're going to hear more about that in a little bit. Kurt is married to his wife, Dee Dee. They have 5 kids, 10 grandkids, and my prayer is that as Kurt shares his story, that God would both encourage and challenge you to live bigger than maybe you currently are. So without further ado, let's give him a round of applause as Kurt comes to join us.
Thanks, Mark. Well, good morning. All right. Well, I appreciate and I am honored and thrilled to have the opportunity to be here with you on this morning. As Mark said, I am a pastor's kid, been born and raised here in the city of Milwaukee, and I am just, again, thrilled to be here with you this morning. And one of the things that I would love to have an opportunity to speak with you on this morning is just somewhat the cycles of poverty and generational poverty, and hopefully to have a greater understanding of what that looks like, because my life is personally connected to that story as well. And here's the thing, is like none of us have a choice in who we were born to, where we were born at, and we didn't have a choice in a number of things in our lives. However, we still have a history. And I think it's really important that I am able to try to connect even my life to the history of what transpired in this country. And so I have a graph that I would like to share with you today, and helping you to understand some of the issues with poverty and the generations of poverty and where some of that stems from, essentially by even walking you through even my own history. And the first graph that I have here, you'll see on the screen, and this is, when we're talking about poverty, we got to be talking about education, we got to be talking about economics, we got to be talking about policy and housing and all of those issues. And so connecting back to my history is, I'm more associated with those that have been marginalized. And so when you begin to start looking at those that have been marginalized in this country versus those that the non-marginalized, in 1567, we would have seen 100 years of progress for the non-marginalized community and 100 years of regression for those that have been marginalized, again, which I am more closely associated with. In 1667, you're talking about 200 years of regression. So what you see is a whole that's being developed. And so you see 200 years of progression for the non-marginalized. And so we get all the way up to 1867, and what we see is 400 years of regression for the marginalized and 400 years of progression for the non-marginalized. And my dad, again, tapping back into my history between 1867 and 1967, is where my dad was born, and when he grew up in Oxford, Mississippi, and there's a whole gamut that goes along with that. But again, looking at this chart, even as we look in 2020, we're now 153 years of digging ourselves out of a hole that had been dug for about 400 years. If you look at the second part of the graph, the next graph, as you'll see in 2067, is when we'll reach the halfway mark of digging the marginalized out of the hole that had been created. And a whopping 2267 is when the marginalized community would find themselves at ground zero. Now, I used to say there's like a 400-year difference between the marginalized and non-marginalized, but what you really find is essentially an 800-year difference, because by 2267, you'll find 800 years of progression for the non-marginalized community, and the marginalized community are just now hitting ground zero. Now, let me tell you a little bit about my story. Again, my dad was not allowed to vote until he was 31 years old, so I'm not far removed from this whole situation. And so my dad was born in Oxford, Mississippi, again, and he grew up during the Jim Crow era. And so my dad actually had a perspective of race that would that he would eventually pour down into his children as well. And so his experience of going through the Jim Crow era and all of those things that transpired during that time, that's kind of what painted his view of our country. And my dad, he had a 3rd grade education. My mom, she had an 8th grade education. And so they were really happy to get away from the South and migrated here to the North. But again, his lens was based off of his experiences. And so his lens was what he poured down on his children. So I grew up with this lens, believing that like I couldn't become anything that I wanted to become. My dad was also a pastor. And it was funny because my dad really couldn't read, but somehow he figured out a way to read the Bible. And so the interesting thing is I grew up in a church that was, it's a very strict church, and as I grew up into that church, it was like a 2-part process to salvation, and I could never get past the second part of that process. And I remember I was begging God for salvation, but it seemed like God didn't want me. And I looked at God as like this evil dude who just wanted to give out salvation to people that he liked. I didn't understand it. It was, and so after a while, I just said, screw it. You know, I'm like, it's too hard to appease this God, and I'm just like, I just screw it. And so what I found myself doing is, we live right down the street from the projects, and I found myself going to the projects, knocking on doors, and I began to start establishing my first launch team for a gang in the Central City. And I knock on one door, and kids come out, and next thing you know, at 13 years old, I'm running around in gangs in the city of Milwaukee. From running around in gangs, as I became a young adult, I decided to take it to another level, and I became a drug dealer. And I was really good at being a drug dealer. I was a pretty good businessman. And you know what? Because I grew up in poverty, and it's really interesting when I say this because like my dad was a construction worker, and for like 5.5 months out of the year, we were like very low middle class. And the rest of the year he was laid off, and we're living off government cheese and food stamps, and so it was a really weird dynamic. But we didn't have nice things. We didn't have nice things at all. Didn't get an opportunity to experience any of that. And so when I became a drug dealer, for me, is I just really wanted to be able to have things. I thought if I could have things that it would make me feel better and all those things. And think about it again. This is the poverty mindset. It's because even though I had both parents at home and they taught us right, I still lived in an environment that when I left out of the house, there was still an environment that was waiting on me. There were still other friends and everybody else outside of my home that were also living in poverty, and there was this mindset. And we did see people in our community that were going to work, and there was more blue-collar people that were going to work, but I never had the opportunity to see a black lawyer. I never had the opportunity to see a black doctor. I never had an opportunity to see a black architect or a black newscaster. Those fields were not a reality for me. At least that's how I felt. And so, but what I did see, and again, there's nothing wrong with blue collar, but it wasn't what appealed to me. I wanted to do something else. But in my neighborhood, what I did see is drug dealers and fancy cars and clothes. They had all the girls, and they were popular, and that just appealed to me. And so I found myself turning to that, and again, I became really good at it, and because I became really good at it, and because I wanted the fame and the fortune, I became a target. I didn't realize what came with being a drug dealer. I thought I could just make a bunch of money, go to the club, and be popular, and I had no idea that people would want to kill me. And so I was robbed 3 times by gunpoint. I was shot at. And the last time I was robbed, it did something to me, because the last time that I was robbed, they told me to get down on my knees, and 2 weeks earlier, they told my friend and his father to get down on their knees, and they were both executed in the back of their head. And now 2 weeks later, I'm being told to get down on my knees. And it was at that moment that I just said, Lord, forgive me, because I figured that's all I had enough time for. When I seen that I was still alive, I said, God, if you get me out of this situation, I promise you I'm done. Just get me out of this situation. And miraculously, after they had stole the dope, they wanted the money, and for whatever reason, I didn't want to give them the money. And like, what am I going to do with money, and I'm dead? And I'm thinking to myself, and I'm telling you, this is how the poverty mind thinks, is because I'm thinking to myself, man, if I give them all my money, like, I ain't going to have no money. But I'm going to be dead. Like, but I wouldn't give them the money, and I'm like, and so I'm going back and forth with the robbers, and I'm like, fine, I'll show you where the money is at. And they let me get to I was on the top porch of a duplex, and they let me get to the top porch, and I opened up the door. When I opened up the door, I saw the sun, and I'm gonna tell you, the sun was the most beautiful thing that I'd ever seen in my life at that moment, because it seemed like I saw the sun in the sun. And I opened up that door, and I reached underneath the banister as though that I was reaching for some money, and I just flipped my body off the banister, and I landed on my feet, and I ran like nobody's business. And I did what you're not supposed to do. When you're in the game, you ain't supposed to call the police when you get robbed, but I called the police. Then they came in, and the police realized that this was a drug robbery, and they weren't too willing to help me in that situation. At this juncture, I'm just like, Lord, I just want this over so things can change. But long story short, I knew at that moment that God had spared my life. I didn't know why he spared my life, because I never finished the second part of the process, remember? But I knew I was done. And so I went ahead and I took a job, pretty much my first job. And I'm making $7.50 an hour as a delivery driver for a pharmaceutical company. So I'm still delivering drugs. But this time they're going to hospitals and doctor's offices. And the most interesting thing, my job was in Sussex, Wisconsin. And so now, like, I'm in a place where, like, I never really hung out at. Like, most of my life was in the central city of Milwaukee. And it was perfect timing, because people in Milwaukee wanted to kill me. And so now I'm in Sussex, and I'm expecting what my daddy prepared me for. Like my daddy prepared me that people are not going to like you, they're going to mistreat you, they're going to discriminate against you and all of those things. So I'm bracing myself for this. And so I go to Sussex, and my route is in Oconomo Walk. I'm in Jefferson, I'm in Delafield, I'm in all of these areas where there ain't a whole lot of black folks at. And I'm bracing myself for what I'm getting ready to expect, but I ended up experiencing actually just the opposite. Nobody treated me bad. In fact, my boss began to put his arms around me, and I couldn't understand why he was putting his arms around me. But he asked me if I would be willing to come off of the road and come into the warehouse, and he made me warehouse manager. And now I'm spending all of my time in Sussex. I won't even go home until it's time to go to bed. Because again, people in Milwaukee want to kill me. So my social life is now in Sussex, Wisconsin. I'm hanging out at Sussex Bowl and man, this is great. So I'm now starting to live a multi-ethnic lifestyle. And so what ends up happening, my boss begins to put his arms around me, and he was not a Christian. And he told me, he said, you know what, I'll bring you into the front office and train you on anything that you want to learn if you're willing to punch out. And I'm thinking, in my poverty mindset, this white man wants me to work for free. And I'm thinking to myself, well, you know what, Kurt, you don't have much of an education. The only experience you have is as a drug dealer. Maybe you ought to give this a shot. And I'm like, okay, I punch out and I go to the front office, and he trains me on everything there is in the front office. And next thing you know, somebody leaves to another branch, and nobody in the company knew how to do the job but me. He put me into the role. And I'm like, man, you know what? I can do this. I could do this. And I found myself working myself up through that front office. We were the 63rd ranked branch in the country. I worked my way up to the second in charge of that branch, and in a period of 16 months, we went from the 63rd ranked branch in the country to number 1 in the country. And I remember getting a phone call from our corporate office in Jackson, Mississippi. They're like, well, we heard about what you did in Wisconsin. We are going to put you over 13 branches around the country in our corporate office. And I drove home, and I'm stopped at a stop sign, and I just started crying because I could not understand, why am I experiencing God's grace and I had not passed the second part of the process? So I go to Jackson, Mississippi, and within 2 weeks of being in Jackson, Mississippi, I get a knock at the door. It's raining outside. It's dark, and there's this older white gentleman, and he wants to share the gospel. And I'm like, man, first of all, I'm wondering, dude, why are you out here evangelizing? And it's dark and it's raining, but I tell him, I'm like, boy, you're wasting your time. I'm a pastor's kid. I already know about the gospel. You can go share it with somebody else. And then he asked me the question, well, if you died today, what would be your reason you tell God to let you in? And I gave every reason in the book, and he stopped me, and he showed me Romans 10:9. And I'd never seen Romans 10:9 a day in my life. And it said that if you confess with your mouth, and that if you believe in your heart that God has raised Jesus from the dead, it says that you shall be saved. And I'm like, hold up, man. Let me make sure that's a King James version. Because in the black community, especially during them times, anything other than the King James version, you trying to trick me. But this older white gentleman, he had a King James version. He came prepared. And I'm pulling my hair out because I'm like, why is that in there? How did that get in there? Nobody had ever told me this. And I'm like, no, you got to be holy. You got to be righteous in it. And he's like, read it again. I'm like, no, you got. And he kept making me read it again. And eventually he left, and he left me with the Bible. And I just kept reading it. And I tossed and turned all that night. And I wake up finally about 4:30 in the morning, and I'm like, man, if this is true, then I've been saved since I was 8 years old. I cried like a baby because all my life I lived on the outside. All my life I lived on the outside looking in, thinking that I was too bad for God's grace and his mercy. But when I learned that somebody like me could have salvation, I mean, this story, it never gets old for me. I never get disconnected from grace because I am a living proof of the grace of Jesus Christ. And when I realized that, I found myself in a local church, became an ordained minister at a local church, and when I came back to Milwaukee, I planted my first church in 2005, and I was still living this multi-ethnic lifestyle. The first church that I planted was probably 99% black. And I couldn't figure out, like, man, why can't I seem to have the church to look like my lifestyle? But it wasn't quite happening. But the interesting thing, and before I go further in my church planting, is the interesting thing that has transpired in my life is the two most important things that's transpired in my life in the secular world debunked my whole idea of the white community. It's a white man who put his arms around me and loved on me and helped me become a corporate executive. I essentially took a drug dealer with no education and turned him into a corporate executive. So again, debunked my whole idea of the other. The experience in Jackson, Mississippi with the older white gentleman knocking on my door to share the gospel, again, debunks the whole idea of what I expected of the other. And so what I learned is that you can't use broad strokes for groups of people, because I experienced something completely different. And I'm not saying that racism and discrimination don't exist. I believe it do exist, because many people in my community, my friends and my family, they all can attest that they've experienced it. But God shielded me from it, because who would know that 9 years after planting this 99% black church in 2005, that I would be pastor of a predominantly white church. And so all of a sudden now that God is shifting me and placing me in an area of what he had prepared me for many, many years earlier. And so now, not only was it the multi-ethnic lifestyle, but even ministry was beginning to look like what heaven would look like. And so after stepping away from that ministry just about a year ago, God began to stir it in my heart to go even further and planting You Flourish Church, to be intentionally focused about bringing people together who are different, may vote different, may think different, may look different. The only thing that separates people on both sides of the aisle is the opportunity to sit together and to get to know one another. And I'm saying that because I have this neat perspective to be able to sit on both sides of the aisle and love people on both sides of the aisle. And I see that God is doing some amazing things even in the midst of the things that are dividing us. And so as I was planning a church on the north side of Milwaukee prior to the one that I'm doing right now, we were doing launch team informational sessions, and we did one in West Dallas, and that went well. We did one on the east side, that went well, and we did one in my neighborhood on 40th and Hampton, Central City, Milwaukee. A guy came into the library, and he essentially accused me of being the blackface for a white church to make a bunch of promises, and then we would leave the city. And it was at that moment that I had to defend myself. And I'm like, wait, hold up for a moment, because my wife and I were planning on moving to Grafton, Wisconsin. We were done with Milwaukee. And all of a sudden, God began to challenge my heart. And it was at that moment that I told that guy, I'm like, hold up, I live right around the corner. And as soon as I said that I live right around the corner, it seemed like he backed down. I remember going home that day, and I told my wife, I'm like, we can't leave. We got to stay. And she's like, are you sure you heard from the Lord? I'm like, I'm sure I heard from the Lord. And so what we began to do is we began to go to door, knocking on doors, getting to know who our neighbors were. And the more that we knocked on doors, the more we realized that there were other people on the block who was just like us that were suffering in silence. I realized that there was more good people on the block than there was the bad. Because oftentimes we find ourselves just looking at the bad. And I found myself repenting, and so the church made the decision that we would adopt a block, and then the church went through a leadership change, and when the church went through a leadership change, it said we can no longer adopt a block, but now I'm the face of a promise that I refuse to break. And so I launched Bridge Builders, and I began to bring in missionaries from all over the country. And so something was beginning to happen that I didn't realize, because when I first went into this, I thought we were going to physically improve the neighborhood. But what ended up happening is we're bringing in people who are coming from rural cities from all over the country. They're coming from suburban cities from all over the country, and they had never ever had experienced a Central City experience a day in their lives. But I started seeing a cultural exchange that was beginning to happen, that God was doing something, and it was just like, just bring people to the table and watch what God does. And so people were leaving out, repenting, because they didn't think that anything good was in the Central City. The people who were in the Central City were staying, repenting, because they didn't think that there was anything good outside of the Central City. Ladies and gentlemen, I just think it's a perfect storm of what we see right now that's in our country, that we could begin to start binding hands together and understanding that we do have different backgrounds, we come from different places, we have different experiences, but the one thing that we have in common is Jesus. The one thing that we have in common is Jesus. And I'm so thankful that God would use an unbeliever to reach across the aisle to love on me. And I want you to understand this, is that before the gospel ever impacted my life, God used an unbeliever to address my physical situation. By the time the gospel was presented to me, my physical situation had been changed and transformed. And so it was much easier for me to be receptive of the gospel. And ladies and gentlemen, as we are all the light of the world, as we're all salt of the earth, my challenge to you is, would you be willing to live big and love others across the aisle? Ladies and gentlemen, that is the power of the gospel of Jesus Christ. It's the one thing that we all have in common. And it's the one thing that we can all share with people from all places, from all areas and all backgrounds. Will you take that challenge today? Will you live big with your heart? Will you live big with the gospel that's been placed inside of you? Let us pray. God, you are good. We love you and we thank you for your mercy, for your grace, your love and your kindness, God. I thank you for this group of people, God, and what you're stirring up in their hearts today, God. God, we thank you for this ministry, God, and God, the heart that you've placed in your people, God, to live big, God. Father, we just pray right now, God, that you would allow that impact, God, to begin to break down walls that are dividing your people. But God, we know that you are able, God, and we just pray that you would use us as your vessels, God, to operate according to your will and your way. God, we give you praise until we meet again. In Jesus' name, amen.
Kurt's idea there that we can be Jesus, represent Jesus, and have the impact of Jesus in our community without just saying the name of Jesus is huge. And the way that we can do that is by living big. So here's the one thing I want you to do. I want you to go to our website, theridgecc.com/livebig. And it's at that website you're going to see all of the ways that you can live big, how you can give, and everything that's given to live big goes to our communities and all of our partner organizations. You can serve in our community and you can love big in our community. And remember, our goal is 100% participation, which means we want you, wherever you are and whoever you're watching with, to join and live big, because when we all do this, it's a bigger impact in all of our communities. So go to that website, you'll see all of the ways that you can participate. There's even some merch available there that if you purchase that and it's shipped to you, all the proceeds to that actually go towards Live Big as well. Now next week, we're going to wrap up Live Big by doing something we've never done before. And that is there's a group of people as part of the Ridge that actually lived in a big way outside of Live Big, that their experience was so incredible, we actually put together a little documentary to show you about that whole experience. It's going to be very encouraging to you, so bring a friend and watch with a friend and make sure you join us for that. In fact, you can just subscribe to our YouTube channel right now and you'll be notified when that is available, as well as any other content that we put throughout the week is available as well. Hey, thanks so much for living big with us. I hope you have a great week, and we'll see you then. Thanks again.